The war on terror. There's a phrase you probably haven't heard in a while, and probably thankful that you haven't heard that. But that used to be all the rage, especially from really 2001 all the way up into the 2015s or 2016s. But unfortunately, it's making a comeback, and not for good reasons either. We've had some recent issues going on in the Middle East with our troops. We've talked here on our show where some of our troops in Jordan were killed. A bunch of others have been attacked in Iraq and in Syria. And then here now recently, it's back in the news for a slightly different reason. And that is apparently the Iraqi government is ready to kick Americans out of Iraq. In fact, we actually have some specific negotiations going on between the governments of Iraq and the United States, saying that it's time to for you guys to go back home, for you to do your own job here. And of course, that's opened up a big can of worms in the United States of, wait, do we want to leave? Do we want to stay in Afghanistan or in Iraq forever? Sorry, Freudian slip there. And of course, that was the whole debate about what happened when we got out of Afghanistan, and that has resurfaced because of the third anniversary of that. We're going to get into all that in a minute. But there's nobody better to talk about this than today's guest, back after a long hiatus. And that is Mike Dimino, former CIA counterterrorism officer and current fellow at Defense Priorities, where I also work. Mike, first of all, just welcome back.
Thanks, man. Good to be with you. It's always fun coming on here. And I think, the third anniversary on Afghanistan kind of gives us an opportunity to jump into some of these topics more than we might otherwise.
Yes, we did. And I'm really glad, too, because too many people just used it as a caricature. That we, quote, can't leave Iraq, or we can't leave Syria, or, to fill in the blank. All kinds of bad things are going to happen, some of which I'm going to show you what some of the people are saying here shortly. But one of the things I want to point out is that I think actually earlier today, Defense Priorities actually published some information on its Twitter publication. I'm sorry, on its email publication. Gary, if you could bring that one up there, where we were talking about, this potential forthcoming deal with Baghdad could bring thousands of U.S. troops home. I think that if the deal is passed and it's still an open issue, hasn't been finalized yet by any stretch, that it would be like 2026 before everybody's out. But the fact that we're at least talking about it is really important. And in this information that Defense Priorities put out, one of the reasons I love working for this organization is because they are so focused on the facts of the matter and not the emotion of something, and sharply focused on defending American interests worldwide. And one of the key things that said on the that I highlighted there on the bottom here, it says, what does the deal even matter? And there's various things there you could read. But one of the things that I found it's really important that needs to be highlighted a little bit is Dan DePetris, one of our other fellows there, who's also been on our show. Far from being an asset, U.S. bases in Syria and Iraq are leverage points for U.S. adversaries who would be far less able to threaten the United States otherwise. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because it seems kind of counterintuitive, because we always talk about how important it is for those troops to be there. But DePetris is saying, no, actually, that's a point of vulnerability. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, Dan, that's a great point that Dan raises. And I think it's something that we should all be talking about more. There is this misunderstanding, I think, that if you have a presence somewhere, a forward presence, especially in a counterterrorism capacity, that it is inherently valuable and in no way is a strategic liability. And what we're seeing in Iraq and Syria, Danny, is very much the opposite. These troops that are there under Operation Inherent Resolve, which is the counter-ISIS mission that is still ongoing in Iraq and Syria, are not actually doing much of anything at all. In fact, you don't have to take it from me. Folks can go ahead and look up the Department of Defense's Inspector General reports that come out quarterly on the U.S. presence in Iraq and Syria, and they say the same thing, that our troops there have mostly been locked down because they've been attacked on a near daily basis. We are now over 222 attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria just since October 7th of last year. And these bases make it easy for Iran via their proxies, right, these Shia militia groups, to attack U.S. bases and injure or kill U.S. troops. We've had over 100 U.S. troops that have been injured as a result of these attacks. And as your viewers might remember, this January, earlier in the year, we had 3 American servicemen and women killed in one of these attacks in Jordan.
Wait. I'm sorry to interrupt here, but you must be mistaken, because at the presidential debate a couple of nights ago, I heard that in fact we don't have any troops in the area. Watch this.
And as of today, there is not one member of the United States military who is in active duty in a combat zone in any war zone around the world, the first time this century.
The first time this, and then there's this report, I don't know if it was the same day or not, but pretty close, that 7 Americans were wounded in action going after ISIS militants. So how's that work, man? Make that make sense for me.
Yeah, this was disappointing to see in the debate, Danny. This was by far the biggest false statement that either candidate made on foreign policy. And I say that as a nonpartisan expert here. It is a shame that more of the mainstream media did not aggressively fact check that statement. I did a thread on this on Twitter that people can look at. Luckily, NBC News and a couple other mainstream outlets have rated that statement from Vice President Harris as false, because it is false. It's entirely false. It's objectively false. It's not even up for debate. What she's saying essentially is that there are no active duty American forces anywhere in the world in anything that could be construed a combat zone or a war zone. Not only is that not true, as you pointed out, literally 2 weeks ago, you had 7 U.S. Army Rangers that were severely injured and had to be medevaced out of the country as a result of those injuries, fighting ISIS, right? You also had a situation in the Red Sea over the last 8 months or so where 30% of the U.S. Navy's entire surface fleet has been engaged in near daily back and forths between the Houthis and the U.S. Navy. You also have a number of American special operations forces forward deployed in these places. And again, by the Department of Defense's own standards for awards and combat pay and everything else, all these places are considered war zones. And there are American troops, as you pointed out, Danny, fighting and dying in them. It's good to see this as well from Alex Ward at the Wall Street Journal. This is just something that no politician, no presidential candidate should be trying to downplay or misrepresent. And frankly, it's a bit of a slap in the face to the servicemen and women that are over there engaged in these operations at the moment. They must be thinking, well, gee, what am I doing on a day-to-day basis then? So I was disappointed to see that. And just to close the loop on the point that Dan DePetris raised in the newsletter, a lot of hawks complain that we don't take a stronger response towards some of these Iran-backed Shia militias or towards Iran. And I'm not necessarily endorsing that we should, but if you wanted to free up the U.S.'s hand to go after these groups more aggressively, you need to pull those troops out of northeast Syria and Iraq, because those are the places that are going to be hit most aggressively if the United States does anything. And that's actually, I think, why the Biden administration has been sort of tepid with some of these responses, because they know that if they really aggressively go after the IRGC or some of these militia groups, the rockets and missiles are going to rain down on U.S. troops in ways that we haven't seen to this point. And so it's kind of a weird catch-22, like you said. But ironically, if you want to take a stronger stance on Iran, or you want the U.S. government to not be worried about U.S. casualties in situations where they can maybe do some more strikes in Iraq on some of these militias, then yeah, the troops are basically collateral. They're basically hostages in the way of that. And so again, I'm not advocating for that, but I think it is interesting that even by the logic that a lot of hawks present to try to defend these bases, it doesn't even add up in that way either.
And Gary, I wonder if you can throw that map you put up a lot about the troops that are in the Middle East, kind of scattered out through all those places, so people can see there are a lot of troops here. It's not just Iraq and Syria; those are some of the ones that get most of the attention. But like you see there in Jordan, 3,500. That's where the 3 troops were killed earlier this year, et cetera. The Middle Eastern, the Mediterranean that Mike mentioned, et cetera. So you can see that they're literally scattered all over the place. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and if you can kind of explain to our audience a little bit, you have worked in this area before, and you've done counterterrorism stuff. And so I wonder if you could, first of all, just kind of tell us a little bit about your experience on the ground in the Middle East.
Yeah, so I went after ISIS in Iraq and Syria and Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen as a CIA officer, right? And was back and forth to the region, was involved as an analyst and a targeter in developing our intelligence and guiding our collectors as far as targets and everything else, right? So it's kind of funny, I have direct experience with this stuff firsthand, and I can tell you that we don't need a physical presence in a lot of these places to get the job done. We just don't. And the technological capabilities, whether it's technical collection or what we call intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance ISR platforms like drones, we are able to do some pretty remarkable things when it comes to finding somebody in the middle of nowhere in the desert and basically learning everything about them. So the US government is very good at this stuff. It's gotten very good at it over the past 20 years or so of the global war on terror. And so what I would say to people is, if you want to keep after groups like ISIS and make sure that they're not plotting against the United States, we have the capability to do that without occupying half of the planet and without keeping 57,000 troops, like you just showed on the screen, in the Middle East. We can be smarter about this, and we can do this with a smaller footprint. And that's what I've advocated, and other former counterterrorism officials, veterans, other people that have worked on CT, they know a lot of this is true too. And in fact, they would be the first ones to tell you that some of the strategic choices that the United States has made on these in these areas over the past couple of decades hasn't really been successful. I mean, even the strategy.
So actually, I want to ask your opinion on this, because one of the common claims are that we need these troops in there to flex other places when we need them. We need them close. In fact, here's Pat Ryder, I think just a couple of days ago, saying something very similar. Watch this.
We do maintain robust intelligence capability around the world. Of course, we can always use more wherever we're at, but as you've seen, as the situation in Europe or the Middle East have heated up, we've been able to put the resources where we need them, and we do maintain over-the-horizon capability when it comes to counterterrorism, and we've demonstrated that over and over again.
So he says we actually need more everywhere. We don't just need the 57,000. We can always use more. But does that help in, quote, over-the-horizon stuff? So do we need guys and all those dots on the map that Gary was showing just a second ago? Do we need them all over the place? Does that help us?
Well, I really think what he kind of contradicted himself there, to then talk about the over-the-horizon capabilities at the end of that clip. It's a bit of both, right? Like, I'm not going to get into too many details here, due to sort of sensitivities on the information, but I'll just say, we've conducted strikes in Afghanistan, counterterrorism strikes, where we don't have a single boot on the ground anymore. And the platforms used to do that did not originate anywhere near Afghanistan, right? Thousands of miles away. So the idea that we can conduct these strikes without even forward bases is true, which sort of counters Ryder's point. We've done it. I will concede, though, that some limited forward presence can enable some of those capabilities, right? For example, if you want to have an airbase in Jordan or wherever else to facilitate some of these operations from the air, that makes sense to me. But like I've called for in the past, Danny, what we need to do is get rid of all of our troops that are not directly supporting that mission, A. And then B, let's be smart about where we put our bases and where we put our troops, right? In Iraq and Syria, they're directly in the line of fire on a daily basis. If you were to, potentially move those forces and redeploy them to Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan or to Camp Arif John, or other places, right, where they're not going to be in a direct line of fire, and they're also going to be housed in countries that are far more less likely, I would say, to reckless drive and take advantage of the United States housing forces in their country. Like small countries like Jordan and Kuwait, I think, are good for this. That's a smarter way to posture our forces and our guys in terms of conducting these, rare raids or attacks. But but the last thing I want to say on that is this: when we put our troops in Qatar, like we have currently, I think 8,000 of them, or we put them in Saudi Arabia, or we put them in other places where we know the Saudis are going to try to take direct advantage of that and rope us into their war in Yemen, and Qatar is going to be on the other hand, kind of giving us the bird while also housing our troops and engaging with terrorist groups and all these other things. I mean, that's not a smart way to posture our troops. So I'd say that we need to pick a couple places maybe to do this that are amenable, that we have good relations with, that are not going to usurp the United States as far as what we want to do with our troops in that particular narrow mission. And we could do it that way. But the bigger point here is on, what we need them for. The people talk about the resurgence of ISIS in Iraq and Syria right now. ISIS has conducted 45 attacks in Syria. That's nothing. That's like a local police problem. And all 45 of those attacks have basically been, a drive-by shooting of a checkpoint, or they've been, something similar, right? They're not external operations plotters. These are insurgents, right? And so separating out the insurgents from the actual senior leaders or external operations plotters that might be trying to attack, Europe or the United States, maybe there is, a reason to go after those guys, but we don't need to be keeping our troops there for every last, insurgent that does a drive-by shooting at a checkpoint.
Right. That's actually where I wanted to go next. Gary, if you can throw that deal with the 2021, 2023 attacks that was spread over. I think this was also this was also in the Defense Priority newsletter that was sent out. This shows this graph here. That's the Middle East there in the middle. If you from your screen, if you can't see all the national boundaries with Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, etc. All these red dots are locations where there has been attacks, and that graph on the bottom you see is over time from I think this is last October. Yes, from October last year to December 15th of last year. Those were the number of attacks per week. And you can see 30 is the top of the line and going down to 0 is the bottom line in various times. So you see there was a bunch of attacks on our tree. You said there was 200 something, I think, since that time. So the question is going to be, if we're being attacked all the time, what are we actually doing positive there? Because what the Pentagon has said and what, in fact, Kirby has said several times, even this year, is that those troops are there for, quote, the enduring defeat of ISIS. And they will periodically show this, a news report or something where they took out this, senior ISIS official or this or that person. But to your point you were making a second ago, here's the big question. How much of a threat are those people that are physically on the ground there, ISIS in Iraq or Syria, we'll keep it there, a risk of conducting a terrorist attack on the United States, either on our homeland or on our assets around, that if we don't have those troops on the ground, they're at risk? How much is there a truth to that?
That risk is actually very low. And the reason it's low is that ISIS has lost the freedom of movement and freedom of action that it enjoyed back in 2014, 2015, 2016, right? When after the U.S. occupation of Iraq, the Iraqi army was very weak. Groups like the SDF and the Kurds were not very well trained or very well armed or very well coordinated. Iran and these Shia militia groups that were formed as a result of ISIS taking territory in Iraq and Syria hadn't really started to exist yet. So there are a constellation of actors now that hate ISIS, that want to go after ISIS, that go after ISIS on a daily basis, that have a very strong interest on their own in keeping the group down. So I think that's the important thing to highlight on this question of an ISIS resurgence. Just so that folks are clear, we're not comparing apples and oranges. I was talking about 45 attacks, ISIS attacks against local security forces in Syria. Your map showed attacks on U.S. troops, mostly by these Iranian militias. And those are sort of
because they're there.
But right, they're there. They're there because we have this idea that we need to keep them there for ISIS. ISIS is conducting a very small number of attacks. And I've debriefed some of these guys at the insurgent level. If you're talking about like the guy that would shoot up an SDF checkpoint, we're talking about people that are illiterate, maybe a third or a fourth grade education. These are not the same guys that are plotting, masterminding attacks on the West or Europe. So that's the problem, is when we talk about an enduring defeat, if the goal is to kill every last ISIS insurgent, you'll never accomplish that goal. It's not possible, right?
Yeah.
So what I think we need to do is change that focus to the very top level of external operations plotters and senior leaders. But even then, ISIS hasn't been able to do much external operations plotting since 2019 because they lost all of their territory, right? So when we talk about an enduring defeat of ISIS, they've held no territory in Iraq and Syria since 2019. Now, they've poked their heads up at times, but they've not been able to have static control over anywhere. And so,
any territory, right.
And so that's what I think. I think that's the key when it comes to assessing the group's capability. Separate out the insurgent stuff from the real stuff that's a threat to the United States, and you'll find that almost none of it is actually a threat to the United States right now.
Right. And we're going to get in a second on how we actually do keep ourselves safe from that. But before we get there, I want to look at one of the other big complaints and the arguments among many in the so-called elite circles in Western, especially the United States, that we can't take them out because if we do, it's going to cause all this surge in counterterrorism threats to the United States. And in fact, one of our colleagues, Jennifer Kavanaugh, also at the senior fellow at Defense Priorities, recently said that, this withdrawal from Afghanistan, many people said, oh, we can't leave it. It's going to be a huge mistake because if we do, it's going to proliferate all this stuff and cause all these, compounding problems. But Kavanaugh said this.
There's just really no evidence that links the withdrawal from Afghanistan to any of the conflicts that we've seen broken out since then, either in Ukraine or in the Middle East. Certainly, the way the withdrawal was carried out left much to be desired in terms of its organization and communication with allies and partners. But it hasn't really damaged U.S. relationships with any of its European or Asian allies or partners. It didn't really have any ramifications in the Middle East. And in terms of the kind of broader terror threat that people have warned about, that too hasn't really affected U.S. national security. And in fact, the intelligence apparatus has shown its proficiency in detecting these attacks ahead of time.
Now, in a minute, I want to get on that last part she said there about our intelligence apparatus is able to get ahead of these things before they ever materialize. But she was saying there's no evidence that the withdrawal from Afghanistan has caused this stuff. But others are saying, actually, there is. And here's one of the more interesting claims about what happened with the withdrawal from Afghanistan from former General H.R. McMaster.
I think you can draw a direct line between August 2021 and the renewed invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, because I think Putin looked at us leaving in such disarray, in such a humiliating fashion, and said, "These guys are finished," and I'm going to have my way with Ukraine.
So what do you say to that? Do you think that Putin was sitting there watching what we were doing in Afghanistan and saying, "Man, you guys are so weak. Let's go get Kiev"?
No, and this is just as someone that has been an intelligence officer, been in the room for these kinds of discussions. There's absolutely no evidence that Vladimir Putin, slapped his hand on the desk and said, "That's it. Look at this plot in Afghanistan. Now we're going to do what we're going to do in Ukraine." That is just entirely conjecture on H.R. McMaster's part. And if he has any evidence for that, as far as the intelligence goes or anything else, he should be urging the U.S. government to declassify that intelligence, because I don't think it exists. And I don't think that anybody that is being honest that has spent time doing this kind of work would agree that there's just no way that it does exist. So the point is also that, major great powers do not make decisions like that. They don't make decisions based on something happening in a different theater regarding another great power that, maybe they think makes them look bad or whatever. That's just not the deal. And I think if you're also a student of the history of the Ukraine conflict, we know that, really we've had since 2014 a situation where something like what Russia did in February of 22 was always probable. And that had absolutely nothing to do with Afghanistan. That could have very well happened while we were still in Afghanistan or after or during or whatever. So there's no real
That's a really good point. That even if the Hawks had gotten their way and we never left Afghanistan, that would have had nothing to do with Putin going. He still would have done it. Okay, another argument that again H.R. McMaster elucidates here, but I know is really common among a lot of thinkers in the West, and a lot of fears that people have, is that if you leave Afghanistan, it's going to cause like this magnet, and all these bad guys are going to come here. And in fact, he says a bunch of them came here. Watch this.
But the consequences are also in the area of a resurgence of jihadist terrorist organizations in an area in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region where there already exist, 28 to 30 U.S. designated terrorist organizations. And we told ourselves lies, Brett, over and over again, or at least the administration told themselves lies about this bold line between the Taliban and other terrorist organizations. Mm-hmm. We now know that there are at least 65 Al-Qaeda related, affiliated, and ISIS related affiliated terrorist locations within Afghanistan. And you have terrorists in charge of a state. I mean, who's issuing passports to these people, for example?
That's probably enough, Gary. Thanks. So, wow, 65 groups, he claims, that are in there, presumably as a result of our withdrawal, that somehow if we'd have kept 2,500 guys on the ground, that all these guys wouldn't have risen. I don't know. He didn't go there. But what do you say when you hear that as someone who's worked in that area?
It's just a little ridiculous that he would mention that there are competing groups, but not mention that they're actually at odds, right? He mentions there's many of them, but he doesn't clarify the fact that many of those groups hate each other. And I would encourage H.R. McMaster to do a quick Google search on the Taliban and ISIS, because the first result is a 100-page long article about the decades-long war between ISIS in Khorasan, right, ISKP, and the Taliban. The Taliban and ISIS have been at war for a decade. And it is ridiculous for him to just sort of not mention that or gloss over that. So, and this is something that I saw, back in the ISIS days as well. One of the biggest counter-ISIS forces in Syria, especially back in 2019 and 2020, was a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. That group is also a Salafi Sunni jihadist group. Their issue with ISIS is that ISIS wasn't radical enough. And so they brutally went after ISIS. They killed more ISIS than the United States did. So again, this is the problem with H.R. McMaster's comments, is he is glossing over the fact that many of these groups bitterly hate each other, fight each other, kill each other, and that the Taliban has a very clear vested interest in making sure that ISIS or some other Al-Qaeda affiliate or something doesn't usurp them for control in Afghanistan. So there's actually a very, kind of structural realist argument there, where the Taliban wants to maintain control. And as part of the Doha agreement, they have pushed ISIS out of a lot of different areas of the country. And even the deputy director of CIA, in an interview with CBS last week, told reporters that the ISIS threat in Afghanistan has not really materialized the way that all these dramatic, sort of prognostications would have suggested. So I think it is overblown, the degree that that is a threat. And again, getting back to Jennifer's point, we have the capabilities to detect plots against the United States and Europe, which are really the only things that the United States should be concerned with. Whether or not the Taliban and ISIS go at it in Afghanistan is frankly not a top-tier national security concern for the United States.
Okay, and that's actually where I want to pivot to now. So we have shown lots of places, especially all throughout the Middle East. Gary, if you can put up that other map there that shows what's happening in Africa as well as the Middle East. And just real quick, don't worry about a lot of the details here, but just so people know what they're looking at. These are places primarily in Africa, all these yellow and red dots, where we have done counterterrorism operations from 2021 through 2023. And you see they're literally all over the map here. But the question is, are they necessary? Are they required in order to keep us safe at home? So what I really want to ask you is, how does America keep ourselves safe from terrorist threats that emanate from somewhere besides where we may have troops on the ground?
Yeah, so this gets to the intelligence cycle, right? And collecting and gathering intelligence and then analyzing it and then producing finished intelligence products for policymakers that keep track of these things. And without getting into sources and methods or anything sensitive, the United States has a massive technological advantage over really any terrorist group in the world, right? State actors have immense technical capabilities, whether it's through cyberspace or hacking or remote monitoring of these groups, even without any kind of physical presence, right? Via hacking into a network or devices or other things like that, right? I mean, the infrastructure that the U.S. government has for this kind of thing is remarkable. It is immense. It is a leviathan, basically. And so, the United States is able to keep an eye on these groups and know what they're doing and know what they're up to, and if necessary, get in the way of these plots. And that doesn't mean that there aren't intelligence failures or intelligence gaps, but that also doesn't justify the map you showed where, we basically have a permanent presence all over the world. I just don't think that that's necessary, especially in the context of Africa, where most of the CT mission there is focused on, trying to help out with regional stability and stuff. Most of those groups are not actually actively, credibly plotting attacks against the United States and Europe. They may be doing a lot of horrible, tragic things in their countries, and that's sad, that's wrong. But again, I think the United States can get itself into more trouble than solving any of these problems in the long run by trying to get involved in every single one of these local cases. I also think there's a lot of research, Danny, on even the core strategy of, well, we have to maintain these bases so that we can conduct strikes on these senior leaders. And what we've seen is a strategy of leadership decapitation over the past 20 years during the global war on terror has not really succeeded when it comes to many of these groups, right? ISIS, especially in West Africa and other places, is still around. There are a number of terrorist groups that have taken advantage of, sort of the instability in the Middle East since October 7th, right? Terrorism is always going to be an issue. And I think you have to fight an idea with a better idea. You can't just go around trying to, eliminate all of these people, because I think at the end of the day, you're creating, in many cases, new terrorists. And, Bill Burns and other people have made comments to this effect over the past several weeks when talking about, Gaza and the situation in the Middle East more broadly. This kind of strategy doesn't tend to work in the long term. And I think that's the other point I would make. Being ahead of these groups on the intel and where we need to conduct covert action to go after them, I think is fine. I think that's great. But I think using a permanent presence around the world that can get us into all kinds of hot water, as we've seen in Iraq and Syria with our troops being attacked, it's just not worth the squeeze. And there are smarter ways to go about doing this in 2024.
And I actually want to demonstrate something here, if you'll forgive me. Okay, so you see, this is Google Earth right here, and so I know this is Erbil up in northern Iraq, and I know we've got some troops on the ground here, but I just want to point out something and just kind of to graphically depict here. So we have some troops on the ground here. Now I've been to Erbil and I've been to Mosul and driven this area here, and it's a long drive between, and there's just vast tracts of all kinds of area just out here. But look, if I'm a bad guy, Mike, and I want to plot something against the United States, I'm not going to go to Erbil where your troops are. I may be going up to any of these areas up into here. And I know from some colleagues who spent some time in Iran in this part here, and they talk about the mountains and how difficult this stuff is, even for Iran to patrol. Anybody who wants to, nefarious, can come into any of these areas here. And that's just one little spot in the Middle East. And then you've got all the area around here. A lot of stuff happened for 9/11, by the way, in Germany. A lot of that planning was done there. And then, you go up to Africa, and it's just nonsense that you go through. And it just really, when you look at the scope, the global scope, it's impossible to have troops there, and everywhere you're going to have them, the bad guys will go elsewhere. So it seems to me the only way to provide genuine protection from terrorist threats, and we need it, I'm not at all minimizing the requirement for it, is only through the intelligence-driven process that covers everywhere, not just in these dots on the map.
Right. And I think getting away from the large footprint that we've had in the Middle East ever since we invaded Iraq in 2003, and we had, I think at the height of the invasion, we had 200,000 troops in the region or something like that. We have to get back to small, intelligence-enabled special operations and clandestine missions to go after these targets when it's necessary and when there is a credible and persistent threat to the United States. And I would just say, if you use that rubric, most of these groups do not qualify. They just don't. Maybe they did 10, 20 years ago, but they don't anymore. And I think that's hard for people in Washington to accept. When they spin these missions up, they never want to spin them down. And you sort of have a cottage industry around counterterrorism. And I'm not going to name any names, but you have people that sort of exaggerate a lot of these threats. I'm not saying they're necessarily paid to do that, although I think some of them are. And, they want to keep the United States involved in these places. And many of them are, registered foreign lobbyists or what have you. And those people are not looking out for America's best interest, Danny. As Americans, we have to be putting our troops in harm's way only when it is absolutely necessary and when there is a vital or existential U.S. interest on the line. And in most of the global war on terror, if we're really being honest with ourselves, that has just not been the case. And I say that as a former intelligence officer that has done counterterrorism for the large majority of my career. And I'm a big enough person to accept that. I would hope that more, former colleagues and things would try to see the light on some of this stuff. People were tearing their hair out of pulling out of Niger. And I would ask a lot of these people, what U.S. interests are at stake for the United States pulling its counterterrorism mission out of Niger? They would just look at me like a deer in headlights. There was no substantive, clear, rational answer. It's just, well, it looks bad, or it feels bad, or Russia's laughing about it. Again, that's not why you put American lives on the line. By the way, in a situation in Niger where we were maybe a couple months away from a Benghazi-style event, in my opinion, at some of these air bases that were totally isolated and now in a hostile country. And so, if we're being honest with ourselves, like you said earlier, I agree. We need to make sure that we are safe from terrorists. There are people that truly wake up every day and they want to kill Americans and they want to do harm to the United States. That's absolutely true. But we need to be a little bit more rigorous about how we are defining these threats.
I would say a lot more rigorous.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And and I can speak to the other half of that equation you talked about a minute ago. When you have these, especially Army troops, scattered all throughout the wind, it takes so much more effort than you can imagine to keep them manned, to maintain, to keep the rotated troops back into there. And by the way, every time we're doing those kind of things, we're not doing core principles of actually winning and fighting wars on the behalf of America. If we have an existential fight somewhere where we need our troops, and it is incredibly wasteful in the amount of money, in the diversion of training, and the diversion of focus, and even in the development of the troops. Because right now, man, we've got so many guys who are their whole career have been nothing but either counterterrorism or counterinsurgency, those kinds of small scale stuff. And if we had to suddenly go and fight a big war against Russia on a conventional scale, we got a lot of people who don't have much experience at that.
That's a great point. And we need to get back to using our military for conventional military purposes, like you just said. And we need to have, under very limited Title 50 authorities, have the CIA and, Navy SEALs and special operators, in small pockets, go after some of these groups where they need to. I heard Eric Prince. I don't agree with him on everything, but I think he had a very good point in a recent interview. He said the best thing the United States could have done after 9/11 was a Scipio Africanus style raid into Afghanistan and basically leave it at that. And he's completely correct. And that's another guy that is, whether you like him or not, has spent decades doing this kind of work and involved in counterterrorism and putting his, life on the line to do these things. And it's tough to admit, but I think he's absolutely right. We have over responded to the threat of terrorism. And it exists. It's out there. We got to be smart about it, but we don't need to dedicate this massive presence, like you said, of 50,000 troops and permanent occupation of the Middle East to deal with this threat. And again, like I said earlier, I also think we have to ask ourselves some tough questions about how much terrorism we are creating by doing that.
That's a great point. That's a great point. But the bottom line is that the way we're doing it is completely ineffective and inefficient, and needs to make some dramatic changes. And I certainly hope that we'll be able to do that, and appreciate all the things that you do to try to move that ball down the road, and especially Kavanaugh and Dan DePetris and a lot of the other of our colleagues over at Defense Priorities. Really appreciate all those guys. And thank you for coming on today again, and really giving some clarity from somebody who's been in the trenches on this stuff. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Danny. Appreciate it.
And we appreciate you guys too. As always, we ask you to like and subscribe. Also want to point out that we are now all over the place on podcasts as well. A lot of people don't have the time to watch the video of this, but they do have time and opportunity to listen to podcasts. And you can pretty much find them anywhere, iHeartRadio, Apple, iTunes, wherever you get podcasts, Spotify, just anywhere you want. Just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive. You got to type the whole thing in there. You will find us pretty easily. Thank you very much for watching today, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.